In our previous video, we have explored Deleuze's concept of the diagram, which puts two opposing forces at play in the realization of the painting, the eye and the hand. Throughout the execution of a painting, the painter can seize the diagram through the eye, which evacuates all movement to the benefit of a code. Or the diagram can, on the contrary, overtake the entire canvas and become exclusively manual. This sets the stage for Deleuze's intriguing idea of a middle ground, a modulation in which color supersedes light. Central to Deleuze's reasoning is Goethe's famous theory of colors, which provides a framework for understanding colors not as static entities, but rather as threads that are weaved in sensation. Having established all this, Deleuze's aim was to find empirical evidence for the diagram, and I mentioned that he found it in the history of painting. So in this video we're going to see how Deleuze interprets this history, beginning with Eugène Delacroix, whose art exemplifies best this incredible passage from luminism to colorism. We will see how Deleuze reads the history of painting through 6 distinct criterias, and how this history culminates with Francis Bacon, who recreates, or rediscovers perhaps, a form of perception grounded in the third eye that had been lost since the ancient Egyptians. One of the greatest painters who ever lived. Not this one. Rather, Ferdinand Victor Eugène Delacroix was the leader of the so-called French Romantic school of painting. According to some commentators, he was one of the very last old masters, and indeed his early works are profoundly classical in that they display intense oppositions in both composition and light. In a work like La Barque de Dante, the dark background appears to be very much influenced by late Renaissance painters like Caravaggio, who was famous for creating this technique in which, from the dark background, the colors appear and are entirely conditioned by shape and light. It is this technique that Delacroix inherits and transforms. In a sense, Delacroix was also perhaps one of the first new masters, if we can use this expression, because the technique he developed at the end of his career became one of the most important discoveries of modern painting. In the famous Décoration de Saint-Sulpice, finished in 1861, Delacroix reveals his extraordinary finding, which is particularly visible in the treatment of the flesh of the subjects. Here we can see that color is applied by little successive strokes, the famous comma, or hatching, that we have seen last time as the basis of the technique called broken tones. In order to understand the revolution that is at play here, let us compare this late realization with an early version of this very same scene, painted in 1850 by Delacroix as an oil on canvas. We can clearly see how somber colors are spread on a surface circumscribed by a line. The form is a pure surface, subdued to relations of light. The evolution undergone by Delacroix is quite remarkable, as now he works with the volume of the painting, the thickness of the paste, and applies color touch by touch. This process that he discovered became the rule in Impressionism and later in Expressionism. Deleuze actually says that it became Van Gogh's famous comma and Seurat's small dot, and he finds ample evidence, at least regarding Van Gogh, in the latter's correspondence with his brother Theo Van Gogh. Of course, the coloristic space that Delacroix discovers is very different from the classical space, which is dominated by relations of light, as we have seen. This new space that is nascent here is the haptic space that was dominant in the Egyptian technique called bas-relief, which is in fact a form of sculpture. With Delacroix and the comma, it's as if the two-dimensional forms on the canvas were acquiring a third dimension, this very third dimension that was used by the Egyptians. And as Deleuze says, it is Francis Bacon who brings this technique to its perfection. Through the centuries, there are many things that make Bacon an Egyptian: the fields, the contour, the form, and the ground, as two equally close sectors lying on the same plane, the extreme proximity of the figure, presence, the system of clarity, from the French netteté. Bacon renders to Egypt the homage of the Sphinx and declares his love for Egyptian sculpture. What kind of sculpture was he thinking of? A sculpture that would have included the 3 pictorial elements: the armature ground, the figure form, and the contour limit. He specifies that this figure, along with its contour, should be able to side along the armature. But even taking this mobility into account, we can see that Bacon is thinking of a bas-relief type of sculpture, something in between sculpture and painting. So this newfound third dimension of the painting is the occasion for Deleuze to define painting in terms of the three distinct variables that he just mentioned: the armature ground, the figure form, and the contour limit. The history of painting, Deleuze argues, is in many ways the story of the relation between these three variables, and indeed, following the observations of the great Austrian art historian Alois Riegel, Deleuze extracts from these variables 6 criteria that allow him to define the painting. Using them as such might look a little bit like a scholarly exercise, but I think it's one of the strong moments in the logic of sensation. It's kind of the table of categories that allows Deleuze to give a systematic interpretation of a few key moments of the history of painting. And it's quite fun to do, I think. So let's see if we can reconstruct this history of painting. Glory to the Egyptians, Deleuze says. Can the Egyptian assemblage be taken as the point of departure for Western painting? The ancient Egyptians notoriously created the technique called bas-relief, as I've mentioned a moment ago, in which figures are projected on a surface that has a shallow depth. It is in relation to the bas-relief that Deleuze first develops the 6 criteria, and he says the following. First, the bas-relief imposes a rigid link between eye and hand, due to its flat surface, meaning that the apprehension of the form through the eye imposes a kind of touch. Not that we touch the painting with our eyes, obviously, but rather the eye identifies the form by going around it. It seizes it by its contour, hence the word haptos, from the Greek to grasp, which informs the expression haptic space. Secondly, the form and background are roughly on the same plane, close to the viewer. There's no difference between the planes. So the second criteria will be about the distance between planes. Thirdly, the contour distinguishes the form from the background, which is also what unites them in the totality of the image. So the third criteria will be about the relation between contour and background. Number 4, the contour isolates the eternal and unchanging essence of the form, which is thus protected, even at the visual level, from the changes of the outside world. Furthermore, forms don't overlap with each other, which means that they all preserve their integrity or wholeness. So the fourth criteria will be about the relation between contour and form. Number 5, the world of change and contingency, which is represented by the cube, that is the third dimension or the volume in which we experience the world, is eliminated in Egyptian art as much as possible. But where did the Egyptians hide the cube? Deleuze asks. The answer, provided by Riegel, is that it was hidden at the heart of the pyramid, as the funerary chamber. The pyramid, as a square polyhedron, is meant to hide and contain this eruption of the contingent world, of death in particular, and by burying the cube deep in its structure, it maintains the primacy of the world of essences over the world of change. So the fifth criteria will be about the status of contingency in the image. And finally, number 6, all things in this world of pure essences receive their perfect geometrical form. So the sixth criteria will be about the nature of the form itself. The focus of the Egyptians is the eternal essence. In bas-relief, this is expressed in the indistinction between background, form, and foreground, which are all on the same plane, as we have just seen. Eternal essences remain integral. They are protected by a solid contour, unchanged by the world of appearances. This is of course very different from the Greek mindset, and Greek art in particular. Greek art manifests a great shift in emphasis from the Egyptians. Contrary to the Egyptians, the Greeks sees the form as it appears in the phenomenal world. Deleuze explains that this is why in the Timaeus, Plato has the old Egyptian priest say to Solon the Greek that "You Greeks are always children, you are young in soul," which Deleuze interprets as a way of saying you Greeks have lost the secret of eternal essences, you can only seize essences indirectly now in their manifestation. As Deleuze says, Greek art had already freed the cube from its pyramidal covering. It distinguished the planes, invented a perspective, and put into play light and shadow, hollows and reliefs. If we can speak of a classical representation, it is because it implies the conquest of an optical space, a distant viewing that is never frontal. The form and the ground are no longer on the same plane. The planes are distinguished from each other, and a perspective traverses them in depth, uniting the background plane to the foreground plane. Objects overlap each other. Light and shadow fill up space and make it rhythmic. The contour ceases to be the common limit of a single plane and becomes the self-limitation of the form or the primacy of the foreground. Classical representation thus takes the accident as its object, but it incorporates the accident into an optical organization that makes it something well-founded, a phenomenon or a manifestation of essence. In terms of our 6 criteria, we could interpret Greek art as follows. In Greek art, the third dimension appears in the separation of the planes, precisely at the moment where thought begins to seize essence not in itself, but in its manifestation. Notice also what Deleuze says here. Objects overlap each other in Greek art. It would be unthinkable for an Egyptian to make objects overlap each other, as that would negate the fullness of their respective essences. An essence cannot be incomplete or partially covered. However, Deleuze notices in the seminars that there is one case in Egyptian art where figures do indeed overlap each other, and that is in the line of prisoners. They overlap each other precisely because they have lost their essence in a way. In this sense, they are the first to escape the rigid system of eternal essences devised by the Egyptians. This is quite reminiscent of what Deleuze and Guattari say in chapter 13 of the Anti-Oedipus, when they describe the freed slave as the only figure constituted in the overcoding empire, which also escapes from it and actually creates capitalism. But going back to art and to the Greeks, the separation of planes and the eruption of the third dimension will imply a new conception of the contour, that is, a new status of the form. Now, the form for the Greeks is not integrally an essence, it is split in two. It has one foot in eternity and the other in contingency. It is not by chance that the Greek temple is fundamentally a cube. Its function is not haptic but optical. It integrates the third dimension, understood as the world of change. Of the Greek optical space, Deleuze says this: for while it breaks with haptic vision and close viewing, it is not merely visual but refers to tactile values, even though it still subordinates them to vision. In fact, what replaces haptic space is a tactile optical space, in which what is expressed is no longer essence but connection, that is, the organic activity of man. With the Greeks, representation becomes organic. It seems to fall into the world of appearances. This is a very interesting observation in itself, but of course the history of painting does not stop here. Following the Greeks, Deleuze identifies two important historical currents, namely Byzantine and barbarian art. He says, following the Greek period, if an evolution is produced, or rather interruptions that destabilize organic representation, it can only move in one of the following two directions. Either toward the exposition of a purely optical space, which is freed from its references to even a subordinate tactility, or on the contrary, towards the imposition of a violent manual space, which rebels against and suppresses the subordination, and the hand seems to be guided by a foreign imperious will in order to express itself in an independent way. These two opposed directions seem to be incarnated in Byzantine art and in Gothic or barbarian art. Let us examine these two cases. In Byzantine art, Deleuze explains, the background plane becomes dominant and depends less on color and more on shadows. As such, it evolves into a purely optical space, as the tactile or coloristic references are annulled or subordinated to the luministic references, such that even the contour of forms now depend on shadows. This is a big change. In Byzantine art, the focus is not organization anymore, but composition. In terms of our 6 criteria, we could describe Byzantine art as follows. The distinction between planes and the dominance of the background are particularly visible in certain pieces of Byzantine art. The beauty of these realizations resides precisely in their ability to make the form emerge from a dark background. And perhaps you can already feel that we are dealing here with the premises of what painting during Renaissance will become. By contrast, barbarian art will evolve in the opposite direction. Rather than digging the background, it will create a new line, the famous Gothic line, which makes the visual space tactile again, instead of visual. However, the Gothic line now extends the movement to the infinite, in a kind of abstraction that is called expressionistic, and what it expresses, according to Deleuze, is a non-organic vitality, one which does not depend on organisms, if you will, but rather on pure movement. It does not depend on form, but precisely on the Gothic line. By focusing on these elements, barbarian artists have managed to create an opposite tendency to Byzantine art. And in terms of our 6 criteria, we can describe their successes as follows. It is true perhaps that one of the most famous manifestations of the Gothic line could be found in Gothic doors and Gothic windows, where something seemingly infinite is happening. The next great period in the history of painting is Christianity, where something entirely new happens. Here the planes are still separated, but instead of the form being on the foreground, as in Gothic art, or in the background, as in Byzantine art, the form is now situated in the middle, in between the planes, such that it either falls or ascends. This in-betweenness is the occasion of a brand new discovery for Christian artists, namely that the form is fundamentally subject to either a fall or an ascension. The form descends to hell, in pure decomposition, or ascends to heaven, into eternity. This is to say that the form becomes fundamentally subjected to accidents, even more so than the Greeks, because for the Greeks, if you recall, the line or the form was still in the foreground. It was not subjected to accidents in that same way. It was subjected perhaps to what you could call a horizontal accident, an accident of collectivity. But with the Christians, the accident takes a brand new form, brand new coordinates, which are vertical in essence. So Christian art, in other words, discovers the catastrophe which became a major element in Western painting. As Deleuze says, Christianity subjected the form, or rather the figure, to a fundamental deformation, insofar as God was incarnated, crucified, descended, ascended to heaven, and so on. The form or the figure was no longer rigorously linked to essence, but to what in principle is its opposite, the event, or even the changeable, the accident. The catastrophe becomes complete, as it were, with the emergence of this new axis, caused by the further separation of the planes and the in-betweenness of the form. This vertical axis, by the way, is one which Deleuze often associates with the depth of time, or pure intensity. The eruption of the accident in painting, that is, a form which is deformed and placed in between the foreground and the background, marks the beginning of modern painting. As Deleuze says, modern painting begins when man no longer experiences himself as an essence but as an accident. There is always a fall, a risk of the fall. The form begins to express the accident and no longer the essence. Claudel is correct to see one summit of this movement in Rembrandt and Dutch painting, but it thereby belongs eminently to Western painting. It is because Egypt put the form in the service of essence that Western painting could make this conversion. The problem was posed very differently in the Orient, which did not begin with essence. So modern Western painting occurs when essence is put in the service of the accident, of the event, rather than the form. Perhaps it was the way for Western painting to integrate the manual line by making it an accident, and it did not give up either on the Byzantine emphasis on the background. And 17th century painting pursued the liberation of light in a space that was now a space of in-betweenness. One of the most innovative painters is Caravaggio, who famously obscures the background such that any colors that occurs in the event is set to emerge from this obscurity. Thus, for instance, the famous Call of St. Matthew, where the figure of Christ runs in contrast to the obscure background. While the integrity of the form is preserved, even in the shadows, the situation presented is always one of change, where something rises to divinity or falls to its doom. In other words, something is called to change, which is the heart of the concept of event. Adding to the previous separation between foreground and background, the form now undergoes a vertical pressure, either up or down. It is on this background that we can understand the modern revolution. In the 19th century, notably after Delacroix and the introduction of the coma, space becomes predominantly tactile again, which means less subdued to relations of light. As we have seen, this is where the haptic space of the Egyptian makes a comeback. As Deleuze says, if it is true that relations of value, modeling in chiaroscuro, or the modulation of light appeal to a purely optical function of distant vision, the modulation of color, on the contrary, recreates a properly haptic function, in which the juxtaposition of pure tones, arranged gradually on the flat surface, forms a progression and a regression that culminates in a closed vision. Thus, it is through very different means that color is conquered in light, or that light attains color. And of all the modern painters, it is Francis Bacon, according to Deleuze, who brings this technique to its summit. Let us see what Deleuze has to say about this. So we are finally in a situation where we can understand why Deleuze saw Bacon as such an important figure in painting. Yes, Deleuze likes Bacon a lot.
Oh, Bacon.
Bacon is able to capture in a unique fashion the two aspects of essence, as a form and as an appearance. It is in this sense that he is said to recapitulate the history of painting. But how is it possible to even reconcile these two aspects in the first place? Aren't they incompatible by nature? Bacon's solution is not to give himself the form in advance, as in narration or representation, but rather to effectuate it through the third way of the diagram that we have seen last time. Instead of being the reminiscence of an eternal essence, it is the essence of a created figure, which becomes eternal. And this is what Deleuze calls power. In technical terms, Bacon achieves this by transforming the notion of contour, which in turn transforms the relation between background and foreground. Deleuze says, a painting by Bacon first of all has an Egyptian look to it. The form and the ground, connected to each other by the contour, lie on a single plane of a close haptic vision. However, Bacon proceeds to give the contour its full status, as it were, not merely as an element of the armature, that is, the background, or as the contour of the figure, but yet in a third sense. There is a third contour, which no longer belongs to either the armature or the figure, but is raised to the status of an autonomous element, as much a surface or volume as it is a line. This is the round area, the ring, the puddle or the pedestal, the bed, the mattress, the armchair, which delineate the common limit of the figure and the armature on what is supposed to be a single plane, or almost, viewed at close range. So now the contour is not exactly around the form, but somehow below it, and bringing it into being, as it were, in the same way perhaps that concepts in philosophy are created. But this contour does not protect the figure from changes and accidents as it did in ancient Egypt. On the contrary, it now integrates them as part of a formation process that takes place before us, in conformity with the history of essences after the Egyptian era. The essence is now seized in Greek fashion, in the manner of its apparition, or what Deleuze calls its fall. We can already discern an important difference creeping into the Egyptian world, like a first catastrophe. The form collapses. It is inseparable from a fall. The form is no longer essence, but becomes accident. Man is an accident. The accident opens up a space between the two planes, which is where the fall occurs. It is as if the ground has receded a little into background plane, and the form moved up a little into a foreground plane. This qualitative difference, however, is not quantitatively large, for what separates the background from the foreground is not perspective, but shallow depth. This shallow depth technique was rediscovered by Gauguin in the great coloristic backgrounds of paintings like La Belle Angèle. It is the armature or background against which the catastrophe occurs, a monochrome or quasi-monochrome surface, before which the form becomes what it is, and the essence is constituted as it falls between foreground and background. As Deleuze says, the separation between planes is enough to make the beautiful unity of the haptic world seem doubly broken. The contour ceases to be the common limit of the form and the ground on a single plane, the round area, the ring. It becomes the cube, or its analogous, and in so doing, the cube becomes the organic contour of the form, the mold. This marks the birth of the tactile optical world. This is, in other words, the Greek moment in Bacon's painting, the eruption of the third dimension, in which accidents afflict the form, in which a body agonizes. While the form attracts the background and curls around the form, as in a purely tactile connection, the background plane also attracts the form, as in a purely optical space. And this is where creation becomes possible. Neither the tactile optical world nor the purely optical world is a stopping point for Bacon. On the contrary, he cuts through them, subverting and scrambling them. The manual diagram produces an eruption, like a scrambled or cleaned zone, which overturns the optical coordinates as well as the tactile connections. This is, if you recall, where the manual power of painting came in. It's the catastrophe on the canvas, the moment where the form may either sink or ascend. The tactile optical world is swept away. It remains localized, but in depth, in what Deleuze designates as the curtains and shadow behind the figure. This makes possible the third moment in the painting, which is called modulation, and which is found in the relations between colors, which at the same time explains the unity of the whole, the distribution of each element, and the way each of them acts upon the others. The painting becomes a pure present, in other words. The manual power of the diagram dismantles the optical world, but the optical world is re-injected in the visual totality of the painting. This haptic space is not only addressed to the intellect, but also to imagination, understood as the process of spatialization. As we have seen, modulation, which is strictly inseparable from colorism, as Deleuze says, takes a new meaning and function. The new formula is one we have seen last time, and here's how Deleuze describes it. On the one hand, no matter how uniform it may be, the bright tone of the fields seizes upon color as a passage or tendency, with very fine differences of saturation rather than of value. For example, the way in which blue or yellow tends towards red. And even if there is perfect homogeneity, there is still a virtual or identical passage. On the other hand, the body's volume will be rendered by one or more broken tones, which form another type of passage in which the color seems to have been fired and baked in a kiln. As we have seen with the example of Facteur Roulant by Van Gogh, the artist becomes a portraitist again, but a portraitism which dismantles light and emphasizes color. The modern portrait would be done in color and broken tones, as opposed to past portraits, which were done in light and blended tones. It would be interesting to ask if this rediscovery of the portrait in modern painting is somehow related to Deleuze himself, who made many philosophical portraits, from Nietzsche to Sacher-Masoch to Proust and Leibniz. We cannot answer this question here, but it is true that what is at stake in painting is not completely independent of it. I mentioned last time that the logic of sensation is the occasion for Deleuze to reinterpret the history of philosophy in a very crucial way. But he does so rather discreetly, even though the implications are enormous, and they are the following. We usually read the Greeks as the great guardians of essence. Greek philosophy, we are told, is the philosophy of essences themselves. There is no doubt that this is true to an extent, but Deleuze's study of visual arts reveals that at the time of the Greeks, essences were already seized in their apparition, rather than in themselves. This is the reason why, perhaps, Plato's texts are presented as dialogues, that is, as discussions about appearances. So in other words, the Greeks do not live in a purely haptic space of essences as did the ancient Egyptians, but rather in a space that is already fallen into contingency. This would explain the difference between the Egyptian wise man, who knows the essences directly, and the Greek philosopher, who has been essentially friend-zoned by wisdom and can hope at best to remain friends with it. When Nietzsche subtitles his famous book, Beyond Good and Evil, A Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, he does not simply mean a philosophy that will take place in the future, for example in our present, but also a philosophy about the future itself as one dimension of time, as opposed for example to a philosophy of the past or of the eternal. If this is true, this means that the philosophy of the future in question will be a philosophy of creation, a creation defined as the ability to be affected and to affect anew. That is a philosophy that is able to create new modes of perception. If truth in philosophy is related to perception, and it necessarily has to be, then this perception in a philosophy of the future will not be through the senses, but rather through a new organ of perception, the third eye, which has something special to it in the sense that it's not simply about receptivity, but it's also about injecting something back, as it were, into reality, affirming forms and truths, and a new objectivity that had never been seen before. The third eye ultimately is about looking ahead in the future, not in the past, so as to become able to repeat difference. When Deleuze speaks of the overturning of Platonism in difference and repetition, I think that one thing he means is this shift of emphasis from the past to the future, understood as this creative ability to select affects that will increase rather than decrease our power to act. As usual, I'd like to address a big shout out to all my wonderful patrons for their incredible support. I cannot thank you enough for supporting this channel. If you too would like to support this channel, please follow one of the links in the description. You can do so via Patreon or Ko-fi. For now, thank you all for watching and see you soon.